Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Dave. We are the IB English guys. This is our fourth video of our Paper 2 series from start to finish, where we talk about two very rich stories, A Family Supper and Stones. Again, this is a slice of our Paper 2 resource. Just a reminder, this is part of our whole school resources that we're offering to entire cohorts to help them through their IB program.
Yeah, so students, if you like what we're doing for Paper 2, you can check these out and see these whole school resources. These are available for Paper 1, Paper 2, IO, or HLE. Of course, we're dropping the Paper 2 for free on YouTube, okay? Mr. Giles, in our last two videos, we looked at A Family Supper and we looked at Stones independently, and we made some organizers. What were we trying to accomplish there in that phase?
We were trying to get that strong foundation in our story individually before we can start to compare them. We really wanted to work with them in isolation first. And so that was the
Mr.
purpose.
Giles, so often I see students trying to work on their Paper 2 and they don't really have command of either story, which makes the comparative aspect almost insurmountable. So again, you have to put in the time and look at each work individually. When that's done, when those two organizers are complete, you move to today's organizer. What are we doing?
We're going to do the fun part, I think. We're going to start to compare. We're going to start to really look at similarities and differences between these two texts. And again, this was a result of a really rich conversation that he and I had at a cafe where we worked on this chart together and we riffed and we talked about. We had a blank chart.
Guys, I'm not going to lie. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
This doesn't have to be tedious. It doesn't have to be work. This is like, we are intellectually curious people, so this was actually a lot of fun for us to create.
It was super fun. And so we would, again, this is the we go, you go method. So we're going to show you what we did with our two texts to invite you to do the same with yours. So let's talk about what we have in our chart briefly.
Yeah, so you'll see down the left-hand side, we have this sort of themes and big ideas. These are just sort of the overarching ideas that are pervasive in each story. And now we're looking for relationships. So we saw family conflict in text A, A Family Supper, and we saw family conflict in text B, Stone. So today we want to look at this comparative chart and think about the similarities and differences with respect to both content and form.
Yeah.
So we can do that rich comparative thinking and writing.
Yeah, it's like comparative topics, think about that. So we want to think about, again, that family conflict, about the son's departure from the family and then coming back. We also, in Stones, we think about the father's act of cowardice and how that creates the family conflict.
Yeah, we think about in A Family Supper, we have the rejection of cultural norms, right? And the conflict that brings. But in Stones, we see the conflict that comes from the need to fulfill societal expectations. So there's some really interesting comparative points to talk about.
Yeah, it's great. We also want to think about death and loss as a comparative topic. Again, these are stories where you'll see that we have the mother's death and how that casts a shadow on the family in A Family Supper.
And we think about all the death in Stones and that man's inability to act and the immense shame and guilt he feels for that. So death plays a really important role in both stories, although in a slightly different way.
Yeah, and it's grief and loss and how people deal with that. The idea of silence is interesting. It's a comparative point.
Well, you love to talk about tension when you write. I've noticed that. So I think silence really leads into tension. Can you talk about that a little bit?
There's so much unspoken things going on in both of these stories. Where the father in A Family Supper, he doesn't express exactly how he feels in words. He does it through subtle things. And again, this is his sort of formidable, reserved Japanese character. And that's, again, part of the silence.
Again, we see that in Stones, where the inactivity and the inaction of the character actually reveals what he's thinking. If he were to act, we'd see one thing, but the fact that he doesn't act shows that shame and that guilt is buried so deep within, right?
Yeah. Another comparative idea is this idea of rash actions that drastically affect families. We know that this is a story about self-harm, the suicide of Watanabe and the suicide of the mother, and the way self-harm causes so much damage to the family.
We see the self-harm in A Family Supper, but in Stones, we see our protagonist take a hammer and viciously attack his wife. So you have that self-inflicted damage, then you have that outburst where you're inflicting damage on other. These rash actions really drive the narrative in both stories.
Yeah, that's great. We also can compare symbols. And again, the symbols of death that exist in both stories, whether it's the fugu fish or whether it's the stones themselves. That's interesting.
Yeah, getting into some of that was sort of the content, right? Now I want to talk about the form a little bit. You think about the endings of both stories, Mr. Giles, and I think this is a great time to talk about differences. For me, when I read A Family Supper with my students, we had some different ideas on the ending and in our interpretations. we could say that that's a really ambiguous ending. Was there any ambiguity in Stones, the way that ended?
Much less. It's definitive. It's got a message about honoring soldiers and leaving, the stone among stones in the way that's really an important aspect. So you're right, the ambiguity versus the more definitive endings. Interesting.
Yeah, thinking about form, what can we say about narrative point of view?
They both have a first-person narrator, and both the narrators are sons who are reflecting on their feelings about their fathers. That's interesting. Yeah. The narrator in a family supper is writing in the past tense, right? But he's in the moment, right? He's not reflecting back.
Sure. But also in Stones, you have that moment we alluded to earlier where there's that breaking of the fourth wall. We don't find that in A Family Supper. So there's some direct interaction between the author and the reader in Stones. So this is very interesting, the way the narrative perspective is formed.
Yeah. And again, another comparative idea, we want to think about the settings and how can we compare the settings. In A Family Supper, it's one setting. It's at the house, right? It's this traditional Japanese house. And the setting really shapes the story.
Yeah, within that particular setting, we might see the kitchen, we might see the garden, but we are all self-contained in that one area of Kamakura. Is that the case for Stones with respect to setting?
Less so. It's more of that suburban Rosedale location. Again, it's that melting pot, multicultural neighbors.
But you have the flashback that takes you back to war. So
that's right.
We leave that setting and go elsewhere through the narrative, through the technique of flashback.
Yeah, we also could talk about darkness, the way darkness is used as a motif in A Family Supper.
Well, I believe the whole story is at night, isn't it? In A Family Supper.
Pretty much like the approach of night.
Right,
it's very dark in the house. And in Stones, we also have the father is very like a burst to light. He doesn't want to be in the light. And again, that's quite symbolic.
So folks, if you see what we're doing right now, just to briefly interrupt, we're just going back and forth and we're talking about what we see. Oh yeah, how is this similar? How is that different? We're just sharing ideas and trying to holistically go back and forth because this is the overarching thinking that's going to produce this rich paper 2 response.
That's right. It's like we're riffing. So we talked about mental illness. We talked about how mental illness is in both texts. We also talked about the idea of societal values and challenging societal values and the way that's in both texts. And lastly, we talked about the fathers.
Well, the father, you talk about the loneliness of the father. In A Family Supper, we have the father just living alone in an empty house in sort of traditional Japan, reflecting on how his culture and his traditions are eroding. That's really impactful on that character, and that drives the tension and the mood of the story.
So here's the challenge to you. So you want to think about how can we compare characters? How can we compare settings? How can we compare narrative point of view? How can we compare the passage of time? How can we compare thematic ideas?
Hey,
symbols?
You're not talking about polysyndeton and asyndeton. You're not talking about this little minutia. What are you talking about here, Giles?
We're talking about rich, broad authorial choices.
Broad authorial choices.
Themes. And again, once we started to riff and build understanding, notice I didn't do it by myself sitting in a notebook. I did it with a friend. I did it with a classmate. That is what you need to do. Get the comparative juices flowing so that you can make some great comparative ideas. This is before we've even encountered a paper 2 question.
We haven't seen a question yet, but this is the we go, you go mentality. We went through text 1 by itself, text 2 by itself. Step 3 is where you do that rich comparative thinking, and maybe, Mr. Giles, just maybe the next video, we might be ready to take on a question.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to talk about the tips for writing the paper 2 and really start to break down some questions.
So folks, open up the video description and grab that blank organizer and go to town with a friend, with a group of friends or your teacher, and we'll see you back for the next video where we continue this start to finish paper 2 process. See you next time.
See you next time.